to be seated. We have been studying in the life of Joseph. And this morning, what I thought we would do is we would actually go back a ways, and we're going to talk about Joseph's mom, Rachel. Now, before I do, I need to give you a little bit of Jewish background. In the book of Numbers, here is what the Lord said to Moses. Tell Aaron and his sons, this is how you're to bless the Israelites. Say to them, the Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord turn his face toward you and give you peace. So they'll put my name on the Israelites and I will bless them. The Jewish people take this passage very, very literally. And so what the Jewish tradition is that on Sabbath, Friday night, or Shabbat, as the Jewish people would say, they gather the family together and they bless the children. Now, there's all kinds of ways that they do this. Sometimes the dad goes around and puts his hand on the head of each kid. Sometimes both parents do it. Sometimes they put all the boys together and have a blessing, and then sometimes they put all the girls together and have a blessing, and then every once in a while the parent may whisper in the ear of that child. But before they get to this passage in Numbers that they always quote, they have a little section at the beginning of it, and here's what they say. If it's a boy, they say, may you be like Ephraim and Manasseh, and then they go into the passage in Numbers. The Lord bless you and keep you and make us faith. That's a typical Jewish blessing for the boy. Now, it's interesting because the two names that they choose, Ephraim and Manasseh, they don't say Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And they don't pick one of the 12 tribes of Israel. They pick Ephraim and Manasseh. And the reason is, a lot of Jewish Bible scholars say, that the reason is because Ephraim and Manasseh are the sons of Joseph. And they are the first two brothers that we have in the Bible that are not in competition with each other. There's a non-competitive idea between those two brothers. And some Jewish Bible scholars feel that the reason they use Ephraim and Manasseh is because Ephraim and Manasseh were born in Egypt. And yet, they ended up being faithful in serving God. Even though they were born in an Egyptian world, pagan world, they served the God of the Hebrews in their world. To the daughters, they come and they list the four matriarchs. They come to the daughters, and when they're blessing the daughters, they say, may you be like Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah. The Lord bless you and keep his... And then they go through that passage in Numbers. What's interesting is, in the Jewish world, Rachel is one of the ones that's mentioned. And so we kind of want to dive into this issue just a little bit for us this morning on Rachel and Leah and make sure we have a good understanding of these two gals. So let's go back in the story to when we're introduced to the whole idea of Rachel. Let's understand the story. What's happened is Rebekah has two sons, Jacob and Esau. You remember, Jacob steals the birthright. Rebekah goes through this thing to make him hairy like Esau and get the birthright from daddy. And then basically Esau comes in and realizes his birthright's been stolen. He basically looks at Jacob and he says, okay, we're going to mourn Dad's death, but when Dad's death has been mourned, you're going to die. So Rebekah, mom, comes to him and says, you got to get out of here because he will kill you. So she now loses her son, so to speak, and Jacob now has to flee. That's where we pick up the story, okay? It's in Genesis chapter 29, and here's what it says. Now, Jacob continued on his journey. He came to the land of the eastern peoples. There he saw a well in the open country, 3 flocks of sheep laying near it because the flocks were watered from that well. The stone over the mouth of the well was large. When all the flocks were gathered there, the shepherds would roll the stone away from the well's mouth and water the sheep. You know this from a cistern idea. You keep all the bugs out by having it covered. It said they would return the stone to its place over the mouth of the well. And Jacob asked the servants, my brothers, where are you from? We're from Haran, they replied. And he said to him, do you know Laban, Nahor's grandson? Yeah, we know him, he answered. Then, is he well? Yes, he is. And he said, in fact, here comes his daughter Rachel with the sheep. Look, he said, the sun is high. It's not time for the flocks to be gathered. Water the sheep, take them back to the pasture. We can't, they replied, until all the flocks are gathered and a stone has been rolled away from the mouth of the well. Then we water the sheep. While he was still talking to them, Rachel came with her father's sheep, for she was a shepherd. And when Jacob saw Rachel, daughter of his uncle Laban, and Laban's sheep, he went over, he rolled the stone away from the mouth of the well and watered his uncle's sheep. Then Jacob kissed Rachel and began to weep aloud. He had told Rachel that he was a relative of her father and the son of Rebekah, so she ran and told her father. As soon as Laban heard the news about Jacob, his sister's son, he hurried to meet him. He embraced him and kissed him and brought him to his home. And there Jacob told him all these things. And Laban said to him, you are my own flesh and blood. Jacob stayed a whole month. And Laban said to him, just because you are a relative of mine, should you work for me for nothing? Tell me what your wages should be. Now, Laban had two daughters. The name of the older was Leah. The name of the younger was Rachel. Leah had weak eyes, but Rachel had a lovely figure and was beautiful. Jacob was in love with Rachel. And he said, I'll work for you 7 years in return for your younger daughter, Rachel. Laban said, it's better that I give her to you than somebody else, so stay here with me. And Jacob served 7 years to get Rachel, but they seemed like only a few days to him because of his love for her. Now, if you know the story, here's what happens next. He works 7 years. He comes back to Laban and he goes, okay, let's pay up now. Give me Rachel. So they have a big feast, and in the custom of that time then, they head off to the bridal chamber, and the next morning he realizes he's got Leah. Now, what's interesting here in this story is that Jacob, the deceiver, had deceived Dad. And now Jacob, the deceiver, had been deceived. He comes back to Laban, and he's hot as could be. He's like, whoa, 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 this wasn't the deal that we made. And Laban looks at him and goes, look, I can't let you have the younger one until I got rid of the older one. So you got the older one. But I'll make a deal with you. After the end of a week, which was the typical marriage ceremony kind of thing, at the end of the week, I'll give you Rachel, but then I get another 7 years worth of work out of it. And he's like, done deal. And so he takes Rachel and Leah and their handmaids, and now you have the beginning of the history of the children of Israel, which eventually there's going to be 12 sons. And that's how the story unfolds. So here's what's interesting. Why do we have Rachel and Leah listed as two of the matriarchs to raise their daughters like these women? And that's kind of what we want to dive into just a little bit. So let me help you out with a couple of things. First of all, let's talk about Leah. Leah was the oldest. It says that she had weak eyes. We don't know exactly what that means. There's a number of thoughts. One is that there was some deformity about her eyes. And in this culture, a deformity was kind of looked at as a way of God's curse, so to speak. So anytime somebody was deformed, it was like somebody has done something wrong that's offended God. It could have been that. I don't think that's what it was. Jewish rabbis throughout history have taught the idea that her eyes were weepy, that it's actually the tears of Leah. And we don't have time to do this, but if you want a fascinating study, in this passage, take a look at the tears in this passage. Here you have Jacob crying, weeping, when he meets Rachel, because God has blessed him and worked all of this out. You have the tears of Leah, which a lot of people believe, a lot of Jewish scholars, a couple realms of thought. One of the realms of thought is the idea that she was weeping because technically as the oldest she should have married Esau, but Esau may have rejected her. She had a burden from Laban that had instilled in them that they were to help the nation of Israel go forward by providing children, and if Esau rejected her, she was upset over that. The other issue is maybe she just didn't want to marry that guy because that was Esau. He was a hairy outdoorsman kind of guy, and she didn't want anything to do with that, and he may not have had a passion for Israel. So there's that idea. And then there's the issue of Rachel who weeps. We read in Jeremiah that Rachel weeps for the nation of Israel. We read in the New Testament at the slaying of the children of Herod that Rachel weeps. So there's this interesting theme of weeping and tears that kind of run through this passage. One of the things that you find in this story with Rachel and Leah is that Leah and Rachel both, and I think this is the overwhelming idea, they have this burden for the nation of Israel. They have this passion that the next generation is going to come from them. And it creates a number of issues within the whole realm. So let's just talk about a couple of things about Rachel that are kind of obvious as you read the story. One is she is drop-dead gorgeous. I don't know what it was said. I mean, she is a knockout. I mean, she comes walking. She is in farm clothes, and she's gorgeous. And as he stands there, as Jacob stands there, and he sees her coming, he's like, well, the text literally means gorgeous. How do I say this nicely? Gorgeous and built well. I mean, she is in physical form as well as facial, as well as everything. She is beautiful. Here's what's interesting. When you look at the lineage of Christ, Christ does not come through the lineage of Joseph and Rachel. He comes through the lineage of Judah and Leah. Kids, listen to me. Be careful about the whole beauty thing. Be careful about the outward appearance kind of thing. Those of us who are older will tell you things change. Okay? You look different as you get older. Okay? You change. Okay? The young me and the me now, there's about 80 pounds difference between the two. It's like almost another person. Okay? Be careful about the physical beauty. Be careful about it. It's fleeting. It changes. Now, I'm not saying, look, you've always heard me say this. If the barn needs painting, you paint it. You don't rebuild it. Okay? There's nothing wrong with looking nice. When you get to the point that that's your focus, that's a problem. Because if you're not beautiful on the inside, I don't care what you look like on the outside. And that is so important. That is so important to keep in mind. But she is gorgeous. So you need to understand that. Much like, by the way, much like Jacob's mom, Rebekah, when you go back and you look at their story. She's also childless. There becomes this competition between her and Leah constantly to have children. Because both of them saw themselves as pivotal to the nation of Israel taking off. And this childless thing really, really, really was an issue with Rachel. In fact, I'm going to suggest because of the childless issue, her faith struggled. We see an interesting story with her when she and Jacob leave the area, and she takes her father's idols, and she hides them. Well, those would have been pagan idols, and Jewish scholars actually have this idea that one of the reasons that she took them was because she was hoping the pagan gods would bless her with children. In other words, she was almost desperate to have children. We see the whole, take my handmaid and have children through them, and all of this going back and forth, back and forth. And this childless thing was a big issue. And let me just say this, be sensitive about this, particularly in our culture. We have young couples who want to have children but can't. We have people who don't want children. We have people who are single. Be really careful about putting your stereotype of your future on them. Give them the freedom to not have to do that. Because actually, in some ways, we can hurt more than we help. And I always deal with this when I'm talking to couples and marriage counseling. It may or may not be in God's plan for you to have children. And you have to be okay with that, and you have to figure out then maybe that you go a different direction. You just don't know what happens there. So the childless thing really became a struggle because she saw as part of her burden to forward the nation of Israel. She's also deeply loved. I mean, 7 years, to go, I'll work for 7 years for you, and it just seems like a couple of days. Really? Now, what's interesting is we don't know if she felt the same way about him. We know how he felt about her. And to him, it's one of these great big issues where he just, and you see it, by the way, in the way he treats Joseph and Benjamin. In fact, she's one of the first people in the Bible in which she's actually named after an animal, because the idea of Rachel means you. It's the idea of Laban kind of he saw her kind of as a beautiful little baby lamb. And it's interesting because she's the first, by the way, she's also one of the first people who dies in childbirth. And when she's having Benjamin, she wants to name him Benoni, which means son of my sorrow. And Jacob comes alongside and says, no, not son of my sorrow. He's son of my right hand. And we know him as Benjamin, but that's not what she named him. And we see the sorrow, again, that tear idea comes up, that tears kind of concept. So let's just take a couple of things and kind of talk about them as a whole, both of them. Here's the thing you see about both these women. I think this is why the Jewish people focus on her. Both of these women were passionate about the next generation. Absolutely passionate about the next generation. You hear that? You know what that is? That's the next generation. Seriously. It's fine, Leah. Really, seriously. That is the next generation. And as a mom, they were passionate about that. They were passionate about making sure, so for them, for Jacob to have children to carry on the nation of Israel that went forward, they were so passionate about that. Moms, dads, parents, that's what we have to do. We've got to be focused on the generation to follow. That's our responsibility. I like what one person said. Christianity is one generation away from extinction, always. If we as a generation fail to do our job, it ends with us. So I want to just talk for a few minutes, and this is just observations and odds and ends kind of thing. I want to talk a little bit about parenting, because I think it's important. I like what one guy said. 4 stages of parenting. Here they are. The discipline years, 1 to 5, where you have to instill in those kids discipline. Training, 5 to 12, where you train these kids, you teach them different things. 12 to 18, you kind of become a coach. Role changes a little bit. Where you're trying to coach your kids as you go forward. And then that idea of 18 on, where there's more of a friendship role as they step out into the adult world. I can't say enough. If you need to talk to my wife about how important those first 5 years are in the discipline part of it. She can already tell you what kids are going to have life problems as adults at 5. Because she sees kids that are raised with no discipline. And you need to understand, COVID has hurt those kids at levels that we will be paying for the next 20, 30, 40 years. The thing, you talk to any teacher, and what they are seeing right now, We're seeing all kinds of issues come out of this thing, socially, emotionally, learning-wise, because parents were not prepared for it, parents were not able to do it, parents were not engaged with it. We hear things like, I want to let the universe teach my child. You got to be kidding me. That idea of training, those years where you're trying to teach them different things and train different ideas, that idea of coaching, that time where now everything shifts a little bit, and kind of as a coach, what I tell parents is this: try to, as much as you can, connect where their issue with real world life issues. So my kids, when they were that coaching years, they'd come home and they'd say, Dad, I got a problem with a teacher, and this is how I want to solve it. What are you going to do when you have a problem with a boss? You know, I want to drop that class. Well, how are you going to drop that class? Because what are you going to do when you're an adult? You're going to drop that class, you're going to drop that job and go try to find another one because you don't like the boss? You know, try to connect as much as you can it to real life, because that's what these kids are getting ready. That's where these kids are going to be in 5 years. And that idea of friendship, what I see so often is people who want to be friends in that 1 to 5 year old. I love my grandkids, but they don't need a friend, they need a grandpa. And a grandpa says no. And a grandpa says, here's the rules. And a grandpa goes, yes, no, you can't do that. You go, no, grandpas are always supposed to say yes. Discipline years, okay? That's what you got to have. And I stress this so much because I see this so often. If you can't get the respect as a parent, you're not going to have the friendship that you want down the line. They may be friends with you, but you're not going to have friends with, they're not going to see you as somebody they respect. And so that's so important. So just a couple of, here's just some odd and end, goofy kind of observations from an old guy right now. You know, some of you go, you're not old yet. Well, you haven't seen me try to get out of bed. Trust me, I'm there. Here's some observations. For those of you who are parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, now great-great-grandparents too. I mean, you need to be up here teaching, but we'll go for me right now. You're stuck with me. So here's the idea. I think as a parent, you've got to figure out what your non-negotiables are. If God can rule the world with 10 rules, then you ought to be able to come up with a couple of non-negotiables as a parent, as a grandparent. I like what Andy Stanley does when he talks about parenting. He says this. He said, we had 3 non-negotiables in raising our kids. One was disobedience. We dealt with disobedience because we wanted to teach our kids that the world is a world of rules that you have to follow, and disobedience will get you in trouble. A second idea was the idea of dishonesty. We won't tolerate lying. You see this in the life of Joseph, by the way, how this plays out in their lives. And the third thing was the idea of disrespect. We won't tolerate. My boys will tell you. They never heard me say, you will not talk to your mom like that. They heard, you will not talk to my wife that way. No one gets away with talking about my wife like that. Least of all, somebody she birthed. And that was the one thing. Because this issue of respect, by the way, that's why we have the problems we have in our culture, because we have no respect for anything. And don't be as critical as you want of the younger generation, but we helped get them there. So we got to take some ownership here too. And what I would say to you moms and dads and grandparents today, one, disrespect is not something you need to tolerate. It's not cute. And when you start laughing at it or you start minimizing it, you're going to pay a price for it down the line. You got to decide what your non-negotiables are. second thing I've observed is this. You've got to model a solid marriage. The best gift you can give your kids is a mom and dad who are passionately in love with each other and try to passionately outserve each other. That is one of the best gifts you can give your children. I try to remind couples of this. You were born in a temporary relationship as a child. You get married, you have a permanent relationship, husband and wife. You have children, that's a temporary relationship because one day they're going to leave you. So the only permanent relationship in there is that husband-wife one, so that's where you better be spending time. You go, well, you don't know, it's so hard to, get away, and it's so hard to get a babysitter, and it's so hard to do all of these. Mom and dad, let me tell you something. Here's what we know. We know the greatest rate of divorce is like the first 6 years of marriage. You know when the second greatest rate of divorce is? Over 25 years of marriage. You know why? Because mom does her thing with the kids, dad does his thing with his job and a hobby. They end up all of a sudden, the kids are all gone. They're sitting in a house as two strangers and going, what in the world are we doing here together? They don't even know each other anymore. And so you need to invest in that. Because one of the things that's happening in our culture, the whole world is starting to revolve around children. And let me tell you something, that's deadly. You go, before you know it, what's happening is everything is revolving around the kids. Even you can even do this as a grandparent, where you can let everything revolve around the grandkids. And I'm not saying you don't love them. I love my kids and I love my grandkids, but you know who my world revolves around? I mean, other than the Lord, Jean, my wife. It's about us. That's where we put the investment. And that is so important. I am fortunate. I had people who instilled that in me. There are people in this church that actually took me out to eat and called me on the carpet on it and said, spend more time with your wife. Yes. You know what? We are where we are today because those people invested in us and helped instill that in us. And I can't stress that enough. You invest in your marriage. You put the time there. You go, well, we don't have time. Oh, you make time for everything you want to make time for. You know it and I know it. You just got to make time for them. The other thing is, you got to have mentors with you. You got to have people who are helping you. One of the smartest things my wife and I did, we always had a couple who was the next step ahead of where we were heading. So when we were parents, we had people that were grandparents in our lives to help us understand what grandparenting is going to look like. Now that we're grandparents, we've got a little time for the great-grandparent thing, I think. So we got a little time for that, but I will be going to great-grandparents and finding out how do you do the great-grandparent thing if I'm still around. Because I try to find people ahead of me because they're already in it. They're in the trenches. Why not learn from them? And for those of you who are older, who have been through those things, you need to start investing in some of these younger couples. Because again, like Rachel and Leah, our goal is the generation to follow. And you have wisdom, whether you realize it or not. It's like I tell people, if nothing else, I can give you the wisdom of all of the things that not to do because I did them and they didn't work. I can at least tell you how not to do it. And we've got to learn. That's our role. We've got to learn. That's what our responsibility is. The last thing, and this is the thing I guess that hits closest to me. As you age, you're going to start to see life differently. And you're going to start to see the things that you value differently. And one of the things that you're going to find as you start to age is you're going to realize your greatest accomplishment is not what you have, but who you impacted. It's about the lives that you have touched that are coming up behind you. Now, many of you know one of my passions, one of the things I love is blowing glass. And so I've just made a commitment to it this year that I'm trying every 2 weeks to at least go out every 2 weeks and blow glass and spend some time blowing glass. It's just one of those things. And so Rachel and Hannah blow glass with us. And so kind of our thing right now is Thursday nights seem to work. So what happens is while I'm working during the day, I turn on the furnace, and then when everybody gets off work, we go and blow glass. Now, when it started doing this, it was, can you guys bring us Chick-fil-A so we have something to eat? Well, then it was like, Claire found out it was Chick-fil-A, and then it was like, well, okay, our family's going to come. And then Alex was like, well, Josh and everybody, but this was back before Josh was deployed, then Josh is there. So this whole Thursday night thing became potluck fellowship. And so we're on one end of blowing shop. So this past week we had an opportunity to get in the shop. And I'm trying, I'm not there yet, I'm trying. But I'm trying to stop and enjoy life a little bit and start to realize those gifts that God gives you and appreciate them. So in the midst of doing all this thing that I love with glass, I'm standing there, and I forget who was, one of them was at the furnace working on something, and I'm standing there, and I look over, and I took this picture. And I'm sitting there. Now, my wife's going to hate this because, you know, she thinks we should pose pictures. That I love her, but she's wrong. And I'm looking at it going, this is my world. This is what's important. As you start to get older, you start to change what you value. And you start to realize what really matters. Make no mistake about it. I realize how blessed my wife and I are to have our children 6 miles away. And you need to know, I never expected it, I never planned on it, but I am so grateful to God for that gift. And as I sat there, on the one hand, on the one end of the shop, I'm doing something that I passionately love. On the other end of the shop, the people that I passionately love are having a great time. And we're all together. I cannot stress how important it is that you make the investment while you can. That you bring people alongside of you to help you. Don't try to parent alone. You have too many people who will help you. You have too many people that are in your corner. And as you look at your life, here's a challenge for you this morning, and this is what I want you to ask yourself. When your time here is done, who is left here that you have impacted with your life? Because that's the real focus. Who is it that you've impacted for eternity? That's what's valuable. And for those of us who are parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, for those of us who are invested in the people that are in this church and in our lives, there is a generation behind us that will one day stand up here, that will one day sing, that will one day play the piano, that one day will stand out there and take attendance. There's a generation behind us that carry it forward to the generation that's behind them. It is an incredible responsibility. But it is also an incredible blessing to be able to be a part of it. So let God use you this week. So I close with this. The story of Rachel reminds us that we're all flawed, but God still uses us. Rachel and Leah take their roles as moms to help raise the next generation of Israelites. I pray that God uses each of us to raise the next generation to love God and others with their whole heart. Let's pray. Lord, help us, guide us, direct us. May we not make this week about us. That, Lord, may we work towards investing our lives and the people coming behind us. And we'll give you the honor and the glory and the praise. These things we ask in your name. Amen. Let's